the pawn can only move forward. On its first move, it may move 1 square or 2 squares. But after that, only 1 square. Only 1 square at a time. However, the pawn captures diagonally. If this makes it down here, my pawn can capture it diagonally. Or the other pawn can capture it diagonally. So the pawn moves forward, but it captures diagonally. Let's say my pawn is here, and the knight moves here. My pawn captures it diagonally. Now, if two pawns are facing each other head to head, then they block each other and they cannot move. The white pawn cannot move, the black pawn cannot move. Look, this pawn moves, the black pawn moves. They are blocking each other. Neither pawn can move. But if a different pawn moves, thus, then my pawn can capture it. Or if this pawn moves, my pawn can capture it. The pawn captures diagonally. Now, if the pawn reaches the 8th file, that's not an easy thing to do. That's not an easy thing to accomplish. But if a pawn reaches the 8th file, look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, it can turn into any piece that you want it to be, except the king. Except the king. It can become a knight. It can become a bishop. It can become a rook. But almost everybody chooses the queen, because the queen is the most powerful piece. It may even just stay a pawn. It may even just remain as a pawn if you want to, although that is almost never advantageous. The only piece that it may not come is the king. A pawn cannot become a king. Why? There can only be one king. That's why, only one king. When an enemy pawn reaches the 4th row, look, 1st row, 2nd row, 3rd row, 4th row. If an enemy pawn reaches the 4th row, and then my pawn moves 2 squares by its side, or this pawn by its side, then the enemy pawn may capture my pawn thus. That's called en passant. Let's see, that warrants another example. It's here, and the enemy pawn moves 2 squares. My pawn can capture it thus. An enemy pawn has to be on the 4th row. 1, 2, 3, 4. And the pawn moves 2 squares on its first move and lands right next to the other pawn. Then the other pawn can capture it thus. That's called en passant. My pawn can capture it. See that? Or if this pawn moves there, my pawn can still capture it. That's called en passant. That cannot move backwards or sideways. It captures diagonally, but it cannot move sideways. It cannot move backwards. The only piece it cannot move backwards. 1, 2 squares forward and to the side. 1, 2 squares forward to the side, to either side. 1, 2 squares forward to the right, 1, 2 squares forward to the left. Does everybody see that? That's how the knight moves. Look. 1, 1, 2 squares forward to the right. 1, 2 squares forward to the right. 1, 2 squares forward, can capture the knight. 1, 2 squares forward, capture the pawn. Always like an L. 1, 2 squares forward, capture the bishop. That's how the knight moves. 1, 2 squares forward to the right, or 1, 2 squares forward to the left. That's how the knight moves. I want you to tell me how many squares this knight can move to. You have a couple of seconds to count them. If it's not 8, then it's not correct. The knight can move to 8 squares from where it is. Look. 1, 2, and a cross. That's 1. 1, 2, and a cross. That's 2. 1, 2, and a cross. That's 3. 1, 2, and a cross. That's 4. 1, 2, and a cross. That's 5. 1, 2, and a cross. That's 6. 1, 2, and a cross. That's 7. 1, 2, and a cross. That's 8. So this knight can move to 8 squares from where it is. Look. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And it captures in the same way in which it moves. Look. 1, 2, across. Capture. 1, 2, and across. Capture. The very first move can only be made by a pawn or a knight. Why? Well, the pawns are not blocked. They're not blocked. They can be moved forward. The knight can jump over a piece. The knight can jump over a piece, see? But the rook, the bishop, the queen, the king, they cannot move because they are blocked by pawns or other pieces. So for the knight, for the rook, the bishop, the queen, and the king to move, first another piece has to move. For example, pawn, for this bishop at f1 to move, so the king's pawn moves 4 squares. Now the bishop can come out, and the queen can come out. Look at that, everybody. Bishop can come out, and the queen can come out. For the rook to move, first the pawn has to move. Now the rook can come out. Look. Shoop. And the rook moves sideways, forward, forward, backwards, sideways, but not diagonally. It captures in the same manner in which it moves. You can capture that piece, and you can capture this piece, and captures that piece, captures that piece, captures this piece, captures this piece. It moves in this, it captures in the same manner in which it moves. Moves diagonally. See? Any number of squares. And it captures in the same manner in which it moves. See? Capture. 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 Notice that each player has 2 bishops. One that's on the white squares, one that's on the black squares. The bishop on the white square will always be on white squares. It can never be on a black square. The bishop on the black square will always be on black squares. Look. Because it can only move diagonally, it'll always be on black squares. It can never be on a white square. The queen is the most powerful piece. That's because it can move in any direction. It moves forward, backwards, sideways, to the right, to the left, and diagonally. Diagonally, diagonally, diagonally. That's how the queen moves. Forward, backwards, forward, sideways, diagonally. The king can only move one square at a time, but in any direction. Let's say the king is here. From here, it may move to 8 squares. Look. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 squares. If there are no pieces between the king and the rook perform a move called castling. Watch how it's done. The king moves in 2 squares, 1, 2, and the rook on the opposite side. I repeat, the king moves in 2 squares, 1, 2, and the rook to his other side. Or the king may castle on the queen side. Look, it still moves in 2 squares, 1, 2, and the rook to the opposite side. That's called castling, because the object of the game is to capture the king. However, the most powerful piece is the queen, because, as I have already mentioned, she can move in any direction. Her mobility, her great mobility, is what makes her the most powerful piece. Mobility means being able to move. Her great mobility makes her the most powerful piece. The queen is considered to be worth 9 pawns. The rook is the next powerful piece. It's considered to be worth 5 pawns. The rook is a powerful piece. It has mobility. It has great mobility. Not as great as the queen, because the rook cannot move diagonally. But it can move forward, backwards, to the left, to the right. Any number of squares. After the rook, the bishop. The bishop is considered to be worth 3.5 pawns. Or sometimes just 3 pawns. Depends on the situation. And the knight is considered to be worth 3 pawns. Although the bishop is considered worth 3.5 pawns, sometimes the knight, considered only to be worth 3 pawns, is more powerful than the bishop. Depends on the situation. In an open game where there are very few pieces on the board, the bishop generally is worth more, because it can go rapidly from one side of the board to the other. The knight can't. But when there are lots of pieces on the board, sometimes the knight can be more valuable, because the knight can jump over pieces. The bishop can't do that. And the least valuable of all the pieces, of course, is the pawn. The pawn is worth 1 point, the pawn. So the queen is worth 9 pawns, or we could say 9 points. The rook is worth 5 points, bishop 3.5, knight worth 3, maybe 3.5, depending on the situation. And the pawn is worth 1 point. The king, of course, is the most valuable piece, because winning the game depends on capturing the king. Okay, there you have the